When I was growing up, my best friend was an avid hunter. Now, I was not an avid hunter, but he was my best friend. And so when he asked me to go scouting with him just before deer season one year, well, I said yes. I didn't have the proper clothes for it. He did. He had camouflage from head to toe. I just had my jean jacket, a white t-shirt, blue jeans, and my white British Knight tennis shoes. But I had what I had. And so we went out into the woods that day. And like Tolkien's Legolas, my friend had the skill and dexterity to walk through the woods of West Virginia in the fall with all the leaves and all the fallen branches and to seemingly never step on a twig, to never break or crack anything. And I, on the other hand, was like Tolkien's Gimli. I seemed to find everything and break not only twigs but branches and all of this racket and all this noise, no doubt echoing through the woods. And at one point my friend turned around and he looked at me, and I think the look in his eyes said something like, "If you don't stop, I am going to leave you here in these woods." Thankfully, he didn't do that. We walked a little while longer, and he found a big tree, and he said, "Todd, you stay here. I'm going to go up there, kind of through that thicket, up on the hill, and see if I can't kind of scare any deer out of there so that, you might see something." And he walked away silently, stealthily, and I watched him disappear into the woods. At which point, I reached into the pocket of my jean jacket and I pulled out my Walkman cassette player. I attached it to my belt. I plugged in the headphones and put them on my ears. I remember leaning back against the tree, giving one more glance around. Didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I remember closing my eyes, reaching down and pushing play. And as George Strait, King George, began to sing in my ears, I began to sing with him. I've got some oceanfront property in Arizona. From my front porch I can see the sea. And I remember at that point, not 20 yards away, King George still singing, me, eyes bulging, jaw dropped, 20 yards away is a 12-point buck. And it's just eating, casually, calmly, reaching down and grabbing some more and just chewing and watching me. I think at one point I saw it, just kind of shake its head at me and just continue to eat and just continue to watch. Several minutes passed by, the music's still playing, I'm still gawking in amazement, when off in the distance I hear something, and clearly the deer had heard it before, but didn't seem to care about that either, but now dashes off into the woods, and a few moments later, here comes my friend, this time kind of scratched up, crashing through the trees and saying, "I didn't see anything." I'll bet you didn't see anything either. I remember looking up, locking eyes with him and saying, "Actually, I did." Now, all these years later, when I think about that story, what surprises me is not the fact that a deer liked 1980s country music. I mean, that was a given where I grew up in West Virginia. But what still arrests me and kind of grabs me by the shirt collar and pulls me forward to this day is this: that having done everything wrong, I smelled like Head & Shoulders shampoo, no doubt. I had deodorant on. I was wearing the wrong clothes. I was stomping and clomping all the way through the woods. I was singing out loud. Having done all of that wrong, I still had an experience that was so gracefully, beautifully right. I got a glimpse of grace that day. I didn't expect it. I certainly didn't deserve it or earn it. But I caught a glimpse of grace that day in the woods. In Luke chapter 2, verses 25 to 32, the author tells us that there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was on him. He had been promised by the Holy Spirit that he would not die until he had seen the Lord's Messiah. And then Luke writes, moved by the Spirit, Simeon went into the temple courts. And when the parents of the child Jesus brought him in to do what the custom of the law required, Simeon took the child in his arms and said, Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation. Now, there are a lot of things that we could talk about in that text. We could talk about the fact that Simeon, in a 35-acre complex, the temple, Simeon was in the right place at the right time so that he had his divine appointment. He did not miss his moment. We could talk about the fact that he was righteous and devout, how he had done so many things right in his life that people could look at him and say, he is a righteous man, he is a devout man. We could look at a number of factors in the text, but what I find most attractive, what I find most compelling is this, that Luke writes 24 chapters. This happens in chapter 2. But Luke also wrote the book of Acts, which is 28 chapters. So from chapter 2 to the end of 24, all the way through 28 of Acts, we have 50 chapters of stories, 50 chapters of examples, 50 chapters of illustrations of what salvation in Jesus looks like. Simeon held the salvation of God in his arms that day. My eyes have seen your salvation, sovereign Lord. And for 50 chapters, we see people healed. And for 50 chapters, we see what it looks like when God works through the love of others to bring life and liberation, to bring healing, for those who were outcast to be welcomed, for those lepers who no one would touch or even be around, for Jesus to reach out and to touch the leper, to speak healing into his life, for people to find salvation, for people to find themselves, to find in themselves life emerging and eternal life spilling out and spilling over into what once were places of isolation and desperation, to now be welcomed, to have a place around the table. Simeon held him in his arms. And Luke writes chapter after chapter where we get a chance to see what salvation in Jesus looks like. Several years ago, I had an opportunity to place a rocking chair in the front of a chapel. Beside the rocking chair to place a table, and on the table a lamp, and I turned the lamp off. I then walked around the room before the students arrived, and I closed all of the shutters. And I turned off all of the lights. Some of them were light switches, others were on dials, and so I moved them down slowly and watched as the light faded. Others were on this kind of a dial where we could just turn it a bit and watch it turn from bright to dull, to dim, to nothing. And the only light in the room as the students came in was just a little bit of light coming through the shutters, just a little bit of light around the edges of the window, just enough for them to walk into the space and to find their seats. Now, having taken their seats, I opened the book on my lap and I turned on the light. And I said, here's what we're going to do today. I said, I'm going to read this particular chapter from C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And every time that you hear a word or a phrase, one of you, please step up, move out of your seat, move around the room and find a light switch and turn it on, or a light dial and move it just a little bit. Move it just enough to let a little more light into the room, or make your way to one of the windows with the shutters closed and just open the window just a notch, just a little bit, to let a little more light shine through. Every time you hear life emerging in the story where there was only death, every time there was only despair and hope begins to rise, would you just step up and just let a little more light into the room? And I began to read, and they began to move. Because here's what happened in the story. Edmund, young Edmund, who had done so many things wrong, made so many poor decisions, affecting so many of his loved ones, Edmund now is captive to the antagonist of the story. And she has Edmund bound and in the sledge with her henchmen, and they're moving through the cold darkness of Narnia, as was described earlier in the story as always winter, but never Christmas. And they're moving through that cold darkness, but Edmund notices that it's starting to snow. And now there's some fog beginning to form. But they keep moving, but now they're moving a little slower. And the henchman, he's whipping the reindeer, and it's trying to move through the snow, but now they're moving slower. It's still dark, it's still cold, it's still bitter, but the snow is falling and the sledge is slowing down a bit. And Edmund notices something he hadn't heard since he had come to Narnia. He hears the sound somewhere off in the distance, just beyond his sightline. He hears the sound of gurgling, of bubbling, of moving, running water, streams hidden in the distance, but making their way and moving along. he notices that there are drips and drops from the trees, from the edges, the branches of the trees now beginning. And he notices up here that he watches as snow falls in a clump from a tree. And for the first time in Narnia, for the first time in forever, and certainly for the first time since he had been there, he saw the dark green fur of the tree. And then he sees something else. The sledge has stopped now. It's just slush, and the ground is beginning to appear. It's all happening so quickly. It's all happening, and he notices flowers circling around the trees. And he hears the birds beginning to chirp at one another. And I'm noticing now students are in the room, and they're up and they're moving, and they're hearing the birds too, and they're watching, and they're seeing the flowers, and they're listening as C.S. Lewis writes about the winter disappearing and the spring coming to life. They're moving the dial, and they're moving the lever, and they're opening the blinds, and the entire room is cascading with light as the entire story is emerging with life. And Edmund, for the first time in the story, has his despair filled with hope and his eyes opened to a new reality, one that is greater than the darkness and greater than the frigid cold and greater than what seemed to be the eternal winter. And that is this, that when Aslan, the Jesus figure, the Christ figure, the great lion of the story, when Aslan moves, everything changes. Todd, what did you see in the woods that day? Well, I didn't expect to see anything. I wasn't dressed to see anything. But I caught a glimpse of grace. Edmund, what did you see that day? Bound, captive, feeling hopeless. What did you see that changed everything? Well, I began to see light where there was only darkness. And I began to see life where there had only been death. And I began to see and to feel hope where there had only been despair. What did I see that day? I saw that Aslan, the great Aslan, was on the move. And winter could not hold him back. And death and darkness could not hold him down. Because Aslan was on the move, and I saw life emerge and burst forth in glory. Simeon, what did you see that day in the temple courts as you were at the right place, moved to the right place at the right time? What did you see? And I can hear Simeon today saying what he said back then. As I looked into the face of Jesus, I prayed to the sovereign Lord and said, "My eyes have seen your salvation." Men of Northview, men of valor, this Advent Christmas season, this season where we make preparation for Christmas, to celebrate the coming of the Christ child, this season of expectation and anticipation and hope, where lights are being strung and trees are rising as we see signs of life everywhere. Now we'll see lines, and we'll see car-to-car traffic backed up, traffic jams. We'll hear the horns honking, and we'll see all kinds and feel all kinds of angst and anxiety. But I'm asking us, men of Northview, men of valor, to look a little closer, to listen with more care, and we're going to see, and I believe with all my heart we're going to hear that Jesus Christ is on the move. In the midst of the hustle and bustle, in the midst of the busyness, in the midst of our to-do list and everything going on, we have the opportunity to step up and to step into the middle of it and ask this question: Jesus, where are you on the move? What are you up to? What are you doing? Where is light breaking through? Where is hope emerging where there was only despair? And to not only see, but like my students in the room that day, as they got caught up in the story of what was happening, they too made that their own story. And as they saw light breaking through, they found ways to help a little more light come into the situation, to splash into the room. And that's our challenge this Advent Christmas season and beyond, to ask, Jesus, where are you on the move? Where are you bringing life and light and hope and newness? And how can we do our part to let others see you because you are the very salvation of God.